The auction house fell silent as the small red toy truck appeared on the screen. Tommy Brennan stood at the back of the packed room, his 8-year-old frame dwarfed by the crowd of collectors and dealers. His hand clutched a crumpled envelope containing $300, every cent from selling his most precious possession. His father's faded work jacket hung too large on his narrow shoulders, the sleeves rolled up 3 times, the fabric still carrying the ghost of motor oil and Old Spice. The auctioneer's voice boomed. And our final item, a 1952 Smith Miller toy truck, original paint, all parts intact. We'll start the bidding at $500. Tommy's heart sank. He'd thought $300 would be enough. His fingers tightened around the envelope until the paper crumpled. But let's go back to where this really started. 8 days earlier, when Tommy's small act of kindness set everything in motion. The fluorescent lights of Savamart grocery store buzzed overhead as Tommy carefully counted coins at the checkout. Beside him, his mother Sarah held their cart, sparse, deliberately so. A loaf of bread, store-brand peanut butter, a gallon of milk, marked down apples with bruises they cut around. Sarah Brennan was 32, but looked older. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, strands of premature gray threaded through it. Her clothes were clean but worn thin from washing, and her hands bore the rough patches of someone who worked double shifts as a nursing assistant, cleaning and lifting and caring for others while barely holding her own life together. Tommy had his father's eyes, steady and brown, too old for his age. His sneakers had holes in the toes, covered with permanent marker to hide the white socks underneath. The toy truck he clutched wasn't just any toy. It was a 1952 Smith Miller GMC, red paint faded but authentic, a gift from his grandfather to his father, passed down just months before Dad's heart attack 2 years ago. Tommy took it everywhere, slept with it under his pillow. It was the last piece of his father he could hold. Behind them in line, an elderly woman fumbled through her purse with shaking hands. She was small, bird-boned, with silver hair pinned in an old-fashioned bun. Her coat was clean but outdated by decades, the kind that had been expensive once. Her groceries told a story. Cheap canned soups, single bananas, tiny portions for someone eating alone. "I'm so sorry," she said to the cashier, her voice trembling. "I thought I had enough. Can you remove the milk? And the bread?" The cashier, a teenager with bored eyes, sighed loudly and began voiding items. "Ma'am, your total is already $32. Your card declined. Could you try again?" "Sometimes the machine." "I tried 3 times. The woman's face flushed deep red. Behind her, people shifted impatiently. Someone muttered about holding up the line. Tommy watched the woman's hands shake as she opened her wallet again, counting bills that weren't there. Her eyes were wet, and she was trying so hard not to cry in front of all these strangers. He looked at his mother, then at the woman, then down at his truck. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Being a man isn't about how much you have, Tommy. It's about what you do when someone needs help." Before he could second-guess himself, Tommy stepped forward. "Excuse me." The woman looked down at him. Up close, he could see she had kind eyes, the same color as his grandmother's had been. "I have money," Tommy said. He placed his truck carefully on the conveyor belt. "This truck is worth a lot. My dad told me. It's really old and special. You can have it for her groceries." The cashier blinked. "Kid, I can't. Please," Tommy said. His voice didn't waver, though his eyes shone. "It's worth way more than $32. My dad said collectors pay hundreds. You can sell it and keep the extra. Just let her have the groceries." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Tommy, sweetheart, it's what Dad would do," Tommy said simply. The woman stared at the boy, at the toy truck that was clearly precious, at the sacrifice being offered by someone who had so little. Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. "I can't take this from you," she whispered. "You're not taking it. I'm giving it." Tommy picked up the truck one last time, running his small fingers over the faded paint, the worn tires. Then he handed it to the cashier. "Please." The store manager had appeared, drawn by the holdup. But when he grasped what was happening, his expression shifted. He looked at Tommy for a long moment, at the sacrifice gleaming in the boy's determined face. "Tell you what," the manager said quietly. "I'll buy that truck from you, son. $32. Fair?" Tommy nodded, not trusting his voice. The transaction was completed in near silence. The woman's groceries were bagged. She knelt down despite her obviously painful joints and cupped Tommy's face in her weathered hands. "What's her name, young man?" "Tommy Brennan, ma'am. I'm Margaret Chun, and I will never forget this. Never." She pressed a small card into his hand. "This is my grandson's number. I'm going to tell him about you, about what you did today." Then she was gone, and Tommy stood holding $32 that felt like betrayal in his hands. The space where his truck had been an aching void. 7 days later, Sarah found Tommy crying in his room for the third night in a row. He'd hidden it well at first, been brave at dinner, helped with dishes, done his homework without complaint. But when darkness came and he reached under his pillow for the familiar shape of his truck, the grief was too big to contain. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his back. Her eyes were red too. She knew what that truck meant. Knew Tommy had given away the last piece of his father he could touch. "You did a beautiful thing," she whispered. "Dad would be so proud." "I miss him." Tommy sobbed into his pillow. "I miss Dad, and now I miss the truck, and I know it was the right thing, but it hurts so much." Sarah had no words. She just held her boy while he cried, wishing she could afford to fix this, knowing she couldn't. They were barely surviving. She'd picked up every extra shift available, but medical bills from her husband's illness still crushed them. There was no money for toy trucks, no matter how precious. The next morning, Sarah's phone rang while she was getting ready for work. "Mrs. Brennan? This is David Chun. I'm Margaret Chin's grandson. My grandmother gave me your information. Found it from the grocery store system. I hope that's not intrusive." Sarah's heart sank. "If this is about the truck, we don't have it anymore. My son really did. I know what your son did, ma'am. That's why I'm calling." David's voice was warm. "My grandmother hasn't stopped talking about Tommy. What he did for her. She hasn't been eating properly for months. Too proud to ask for help. Too poor to afford both medicine and food. Your son's kindness meant more than you know." "He's a good boy," Sarah said, her voice catching. "I can tell. Mrs. Brennan, I'm a collector of vintage toys. Have been for 20 years. When Grandma described that truck, I looked into it. A 1952 Smith Miller GMC in original condition is extremely rare. They sell at auction for significant money." Sarah's stomach dropped. "How much?" "I've seen them go for $3,000 to $5,000. The number hit like a physical blow. Tommy had given away something worth $3,000 for $32 in groceries. The sacrifice was even bigger than either of them had understood. "I want to try to get it back for him," David continued. "The store manager told me he sold it immediately to a dealer who specializes in vintage toys. I tracked the dealer down, man named Rourke. He's already consigned it to the Prestige Collectibles auction downtown. It goes up for sale Saturday." "I can't afford to bid on something like that," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "I know, but I can." David paused. "However, Rourke knows what he has now. He set a reserve price of $2,000. The bidding will go higher. I'm prepared to go to $4,000 to get it back for Tommy." "Why would you do that?" Sarah whispered. "Because my grandmother is 84 years old. She's been alone since my grandfather died, too stubborn to accept help from family. She was starving herself to afford her heart medication." His voice thickened. "Your 8-year-old son saw her humanity when everyone else in that store just saw an inconvenience. He gave up his most precious possession for a complete stranger. That kind of goodness should be rewarded, not punished." Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "There's something else," David said. "I did some research. That truck was your late husband's. His father's originally. It's been in the family for 70 years. Then it's not just a toy. It's a legacy." David's voice was firm. "Saturday at 2 p.m., Prestige Collectibles on 4th Street. If you can bring Tommy, I'd like him to see what happens when kindness comes back around." Saturday arrived cold and bright. Sarah had called in sick to work, something she never did, and dressed Tommy in his best clothes, khakis with carefully patched knees and a button-down shirt from the thrift store. "Where are we going?" Tommy asked for the 10th time. "It's a surprise, baby." The Prestige Collectibles auction house was intimidating. All marble floors and chandelier lighting. Men in expensive suits studied catalogs. Women in designer clothes spoke in hushed tones. Tommy held his mother's hand tightly, clearly overwhelmed. A tall Asian man in his 40s approached them with a warm smile. "You must be Tommy. I'm David Chun." Tommy's eyes widened. "Mrs. Chin's grandson?" "That's right. Come with me. There's something I want you to see." He led them to a seat near the back just as the auction began. For 2 hours, Tommy watched in bewilderment as expensive items were sold. Vintage signs, old advertisements, rare bottles. Sarah kept checking her watch, anxiety building. Then the auctioneer's voice rang out. And our final item, a 1952 Smith Miller toy truck, original paint, all parts intact. We'll start the bidding at $500. Tommy gasped. On the screen behind the auctioneer, in perfect clarity, was his truck. Mom. Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. That's my truck. Sarah squeezed his hand. Around them, paddles rose as serious collectors began bidding. The price climbed quickly. 500, 700, 1,000. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. I don't understand. David leaned over. Watch. At $1,500, several bidders dropped out. At $2,000, only 3 paddles remained in the air, David's and 2 others. One belonged to a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who looked bored. The other to a woman with a phone pressed to her ear, clearly bidding for a remote client. 2,200, the auctioneer called. David raised his paddle. 2,500. The woman countered immediately. 2,800. The silver-haired man raised his paddle lazily. 3,000. Tommy was gripping his mother's hand so tightly it hurt. On the screen, his truck, his father's truck, sat spotlit like a museum piece. So close, but impossibly far away. David didn't hesitate. 3,500. The woman on the phone spoke rapidly, then raised her paddle. 4,000. A murmur ran through the auction house. This was significantly higher than the estimated value. The silver-haired man shook his head and lowered his paddle, out of the running. David's jaw tightened. He raised his paddle. 4,500. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. That was more than she made in 3 months. The woman listened to her phone, her expression uncertain. The auctioneer began his countdown. I have $4,500. Going once at 4,500. The woman shook her head and lowered her paddle. Going twice at $4,500. Tommy's breath caught. Sold. To paddle number 47 for $4,500. The auction house erupted in polite applause. David was already standing, motioning for Tommy and Sarah to follow him. They wove through the crowd to a private room where purchases were finalized. The transaction took 20 minutes. Tommy watched in stunned silence as David signed papers and handed over a check that represented more money than Tommy had ever seen. Then an attendant appeared, carrying a wooden case, and placed it on the table. David opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in custom foam, was the red truck. Go ahead, David said to Tommy. Take it. Tommy's hands shook as he reached for the truck. The moment his fingers touched the familiar metal, he broke down completely. Great heaving sobs shook his small frame as he clutched the truck to his chest, his father's jacket sleeves falling over his hands. Sarah was crying too, as was David. Even the auction house attendant had to look away. When Tommy could finally speak, he looked up at David with red-rimmed eyes. You spent all that money for me? Your kindness to my grandmother was priceless, David said, kneeling to Tommy's level. She called me that night, crying, not sad tears, but happy ones. She said a little boy with his father's eyes reminded her that good people still exist, that it's worth holding on. His voice caught. My grandmother had been talking about giving up, Tommy, about how hard and lonely life had become. Your kindness gave her hope again. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is from Grandma Margaret. She wanted me to give it to you. Inside was a card with shaky handwriting. Dear Tommy, you gave me more than groceries that day. You gave me faith in humanity. Your father raised a magnificent son. This money is for your future, college, dreams, whatever you need. You've already proven you know what truly matters. Love, Margaret. A check fell out. Sarah caught it and gasped. $5,000. I can't. We can't accept this, Sarah said, overwhelmed. You can and you will, David said firmly. Grandma's been saving for years, and she has no one else to spend it on. Her words exactly. I'd rather invest in a boy who understands kindness than leave it to rot in a bank. He stood, smiling at Tommy's tear-stained face. There's one more thing. The owner of Savamart heard what happened. He called me yesterday. He wants to offer you a position, Mrs. Brennan, daytime shift, better pay, health insurance. He said any mother who raised a son like Tommy deserves a break. Sarah couldn't speak. She just pulled David into a fierce hug, then held her son close. As they walked out of the auction house into the afternoon sun, Tommy carried his truck in both hands, treating it like the treasure it was. But he stopped on the sidewalk, looking up at his mother with those steady brown eyes. "Mom, can we go see Mrs. Chun? I want to thank her." 20 minutes later, they stood at the door of a modest apartment in a senior living complex. Margaret Chun answered with a gasp of delight, and when she saw the truck in Tommy's hands, she pressed both palms to her heart. "You got it back. Thanks to your grandson," Sarah said. "Mrs. Chun, we can never thank you enough. You have nothing to thank me for. Tommy's the hero here." Margaret invited them in, and over tea and cookies, the four of them talked for hours. Tommy learned that Margaret had been a teacher for 40 years, that she'd lost her husband to cancer, that she had grandchildren who lived far away and visited rarely, that loneliness could be as painful as hunger. "Would it be okay if we visited sometimes?" Tommy asked. "I could tell you stories about my dad, and maybe you could tell me about when you were a teacher." Margaret's eyes filled with the same grateful tears from that day in the grocery store. "I would love nothing more." 3 months later, Tommy had a job of his own, visiting Margaret twice a week, reading to her, helping with small tasks, listening to her stories. Sarah had started her new position at Savamart, and for the first time in 2 years, they had breathing room. The medical bills were still there, but manageable now. The red truck sat on Tommy's dresser in a protective case David had given him. "To keep it safe for the next generation," he'd said. Some nights, Tommy would take it down and run his fingers over the faded paint, remembering his father's hands doing the same thing. But mostly, he learned something more valuable than any collectible. That kindness was never really lost. It rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict, touching lives and returning transformed into something even more beautiful. His father had been right. Being a man wasn't about what you had. It was about what you gave when someone needed you. And in giving away his most precious possession, Tommy had gained something no money could buy: the knowledge that goodness matters, that sacrifice is seen, and that love, in all its forms, always finds its way home.